Commander Vexter's claws scraped against the cold metal table as he shifted in his seat. The sound echoed through the sterile white chamber, making the 5 tribunal members flinch. His massive 8-foot frame barely fit in the reinforced chair designed for the largest galactic species. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his battle-scarred purple carapace, highlighting every crack and dent earned through decades of warfare. The empty socket where his left eye once was seemed to stare accusingly at the tribunal. A medical patch covered the worst of the damage, but the jagged scars extended down his cheek like lightning frozen in flesh. His remaining eye, a deep amber color, held a haunted quality that made even the seasoned war crimes investigators uncomfortable. Tribunal Chief Zalkith adjusted his recording device, his 6 fingers dancing nervously across the controls. A member of the diplomatic Veltari race, he had presided over hundreds of these hearings. War crimes testimonies had become routine after the human conflicts began spreading across the Outer Rim territories. Usually, they followed a predictable pattern: initial contact, human aggression, brutal fighting, coalition victory, or strategic withdrawal. "State your name and rank for the record," Zalkith demanded, his translator rendering his melodic Veltari speech into standard galactic common. Vexter's response came slow and measured, each word carrying the weight of exhaustion. "Commander Vexter, 7th Assault Legion, Hegemony Forces. Service number 7749 Delta Prime." Paused, his claws tapping rhythmically against the table. "I commanded 3,000 troops during the human engagement at Kepler 4 for 2B. The tribunal members exchanged knowing glances. Adjudicator Mordock, a hulking Cronin with stone-like skin, made notes on his datapad. His species were known for their straightforward approach to justice, guilty or innocent, punishment or freedom. Beside him sat Dr. Tassara, an ethereal luminary, whose translucent blue skin pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. Her people were healers and philosophers, brought in to assess psychological trauma in war veterans. The other 2 members represented the military aspects of the tribunal. General Crixtos of the Zephorian Empire, his forearms folded across his chest, had personally fought humans in 3 separate campaigns. His expression suggested he expected another tale of human savagery and war crimes. Cathrell of the Void Fleet kept checking her chronometer. Her aquatic species valued efficiency above all else, and these hearings often dragged on for hours. "This is your 4th request for a tribunal hearing, Commander," Zalkith noted, scrolling through his records. "Previous requests were denied, due to insufficient evidence of war crimes. What makes you believe this testimony will be different?" Vexter's remaining eye fixed on something beyond the sterile walls, as if seeing through time itself back to that distant battlefield. When he spoke, his voice carried a hollow quality that made the sophisticated universal translators struggle to convey the emotional undertones. "Because I was wrong about what I witnessed," he said slowly. "We all were wrong." Tisera leaned forward, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to deeper blues, a sign of intense curiosity among her people. "Wrong how, Commander?" "Your initial reports describe standard human tactical brutality. Refusal to surrender, disregard for prisoner protocols, unnecessary violence against coalition forces." A bitter laugh escaped Vexler's throat, a sound like grinding metal. "That's what I thought I saw. That's what I reported. But I've had 8 months to think about it. 8 months of medical reconstruction, psychological evaluation, sleepless nights, reliving every moment of those 3 days." General Crixtos shifted impatiently, his forearms creating a subtle rustling as his ceremonial armor plates moved. "Commander, we've heard dozens of testimonies about human unpredictability, their emotional decision-making, their illogical sacrifice of tactical advantage for individual lives. This isn't new information. You don't understand," Vexter interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "What I witnessed on that battlefield, it wasn't war as we know it. The humans didn't fight to win. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient hum of the station's life support systems seemed to pause. Admiral Kethrell stopped checking her chronometer. General Crixto's S4 arms went completely still. Dr. Tessara's bioluminescent patterns began cycling through rapid color changes, excitement, confusion, anticipation. Vexter continued. His remaining eye now focused intently on the tribunal members. They fought to save us all. Tribunal Chief Zalkith set down his stylus, giving the scarred commander his full attention for the first time since the hearing began. The weight of those 6 words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Galactic Coalition understood. About human warfare, explained Zalkith said simply. Vexter's voice grew stronger as he leaned forward, his massive claws gripping the edge of the metal table. The tribunal members could see the intensity building in his remaining amber eye. As he transported them back to that fateful day on Kepler 4 for 2B, the mission briefing was straightforward, he began, his words measured and deliberate. Intelligence had detected a human research vessel that crash-landed in the Northern Canyon systems. Our orders were simple. Secure the crash site, capture any survivors, and extract tactical information about human defensive capabilities for future engagements. Admiral Cathrell made a note on her datapad. Standard reconnaissance protocol. What was your force composition? 3 full battalions of my elite shock troops, the Crimson Talons. Vexter replied with obvious pride that quickly faded too. Regret, these weren't regular coalition forces. Each warrior had survived at least 50 combat drops. They carried plasma rifles, energy shields, and full assault armor. We had air support from 6 gunships and orbital bombardment capabilities. On standby, paused, his claw tracing one of the deeper scars on his carapace. Against 37 humans, with whatever equipment survived their crash landing. Dr. Tessara's bioluminescent patterns shifted to concerned yellow tones. Those odds seem excessive for a simple capture mission. That's what I thought too. Afterwards, Vexter admitted, but our intelligence suggested humans were unpredictable when cornered. Command wanted overwhelming force to prevent casualties on our side. The scarred commanders, I grew distant as he recalled the approach. To the crash site. The human vessel had torn a massive gash through the canyon wall when it went down. Twisted metal and debris scattered across nearly a kilometer. The main hull was split in 3 sections, with the largest piece wedged between 2 rock formations. General Crixtos leaned forward with his forearms. What was your tactical assessment of their defensive position? Terrible, Vexter said bluntly. They had no natural cover except the wreckage itself. No high ground advantage. Limited sightlines. Any military academy student would have called it a death trap. He shook his massive head. That should have been our first clue that something was different. Vexter described how his forces had surrounded the crash site before dawn, moving through the canyon darkness with practiced silence. Thermal scanners showed the humans clustered in the main hull section, apparently attempting repairs on some kind of equipment. I activated the external speakers and demanded their surrender in standard coalition protocol, he continued. When their leader appeared, the commander's voice softened slightly as he recalled the young human who had emerged from the wreckage. Jamin Kim was his name. Maybe 25 Earth years old, wearing a torn research uniform with medical insignia. He had the kind of face that looked like he'd never seen real combat before. Soft features, intelligent eyes behind cracked glasses. Tribunal Chief Zalkith adjusted his recording settings. You spoke with him directly? He climbed onto a piece of debris so we could see each other clearly. Vexter nodded. No weapon in his hands, no aggressive posturing. He just stood there looking at 3,000 armed warriors surrounding his position. And he seemed ... sad. Not afraid, not angry, just deeply sad. The memory clearly affected the battle-hardened commander. His voice grew quieter as he continued. I told him the standard terms: immediate surrender, full cooperation with interrogation, and his people would be treated according to galactic prisoner protocols. Else, simple choice between life and death. And his response? Dr. Tessara asked, gently. Vexter's remaining eye focused intently on the tribunal members. He looked me straight in the eye, no fear, no hesitation, and said something that still haunts my dreams. Commander, I understand your position, but we can't surrender. Too many lives depend on us completing our mission. General Crixtos, made a dismissive gesture with two of his arms. Typical human bravado. They often make grandiose statements before inevitable defeat. That's what I thought, Vexter agreed. I gave him 10 minutes to reconsider while my troops moved into final assault positions. I expected him to emerge with a white flag or surrender beacon. Instead, the humans began what looked like evacuation procedures, moving equipment deeper into the wreckage, setting up defensive positions with salvaged materials. The first exchange of fire erupted as the twin suns crested the canyon rim, painting the battlefield in harsh orange light. Vexther's forces had expected the engagement to last minutes. An overwhelming display of superior firepower followed, by swift capitulation. But it didn't happen that way, Vexther said, his voice growing amazed even in recollection. The humans fought back with a precision that defied their desperate situation. They had improvised weapons from ship components, jury-rigged energy shields from power cells, and turned debris into cover with engineering skill I'd never seen before. What shocked the veteran commander wasn't the humans' fierce resistance. He'd encountered desperate enemies before. It was their tactical restraint that left him confused and increasingly unsettled. My warriors advanced in standard formation, expecting to overwhelm their positions quickly, he explained. But when they had clear shots at exposed coalition troops, the humans consistently aimed to disable rather than kill. Plasma burns two limbs instead of center mass, shots that destroyed equipment rather than eliminated threats. Admiral Cathrell looked skeptical. Perhaps their weapons were insufficiently powerful?
Oh.
Vexther shook his head firmly. I watched a human sniper, a female named Sujin, put 3 consecutive shots through the same point on a warrior's shoulder armor. Perfect accuracy. She could have taken headshots easily, but she chose not to. The pattern repeated across the battlefield. Humans who could have eliminated coalition soldiers instead wounded them, forcing medical evacuations that actually reduced the effective force ratio. It was tactically sound but emotionally confusing for warriors trained in total warfare. They were buying time, Vexther whispered, his voice filled with the weight of realization. Every non-fatal shot, every tactical delay, every moment, they kept us engaged instead of simply dying. They were buying time, but for what? I couldn't understand. The tribunal sat in contemplative silence, each member processing the implications of warfare conducted with such deliberate mercy in the face of certain death. The battle that should have ended in hours stretched into its second day, then its third. Vexther's voice grew heavy with disbelief as he described what no military strategist could have predicted. A prolonged engagement where the outnumbered force was somehow holding their ground against impossible odds. By the morning of day 2, I should have been filing victory reports, Vexther said, his remaining eyes staring at the metal table. Instead, I was sending casualty updates to command and requesting additional medical supplies. Not because we were losing warriors to enemy fire, but because of something I'd never encountered in 40 years of warfare. Dr. Tisara's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with curiosity. What changed your tactical assessment? The humans weren't just fighting a defensive action, Vexther explained, his voice gaining intensity. We're running a field hospital. In the middle of an active combat zone, they had established a medical facility inside the largest section of their crashed ship, and they weren't just treating their own wounded. The tribunal members exchanged glances of confusion. Admiral Cathrell set down her datapad entirely, giving the scarred commander her full attention for the first time. Vexther continued, his massive frame seeming to shrink as he recalled the memory. My Lieutenant Crixtal is advancing with the 3rd assault wave when a plasma conduit exploded near the human barricades. Shrapnel caught him across the chest and legs. He was bleeding out in no man's land between our positions and theirs. Veteran Commander's claw traced the scar along his cheek as he spoke. Standard military protocol in that situation is clear. Wounded soldiers attempt to reach their own lines, or they're retrieved during the next advance. You don't expose medics to enemy fire for a single casualty. But the humans didn't follow standard protocol, General Crixtos observed. A human medic named Hyjin Park heard Crixtos' distress calls over the battlefield comm channels, Vexther said, his voice beginning to crack with emotion. She was barely out of her teens, wearing torn medical scrubs with a Red Cross symbol painted on her helmet. I watched through battlefield optics as she grabbed a medical kit and started running directly into the crossfire. The image clearly haunted the massive warrior. His remaining eye grew distant as he relived the scene.
Ouch.
Both sides stopped shooting. For a moment, thinking she'd lost her mind, coalition warriors held fire because she was obviously a medic. Human fighters stopped because they were screaming at her to get back to cover. But Hyjin had ignored everyone. Vexther described how the young human had sprinted across 50 meters of open ground while explosions erupted around her. Dove and rolled behind debris, used cover effectively, but never once drew a weapon or made any aggressive moves toward coalition positions. She reached Crystal and immediately began emergency medical procedures, Vexther continued. Applied pressure bandages, administered pain suppressors from her own kit, even used a portable medical scanner to assess internal damage, all while my warriors and her comrades were exchanging fire over her head. The most shocking part came next. When Hyjin had stabilized the wounded Zephyrian officer enough for transport, she had activated her cum unit and called out to both sides in accented but clear galactic common. She said, "Coalition forces, I'm sending your officer back to your lines. Human forces, hold fire Sector 7 for medical evacuation," Vexther recalled. Then she helped Crystal to his feet and walked him halfway across the battlefield before my own medics took over. Tribunal Chief Zalkith leaned forward. "This medic, she was unharmed during this exchange, not a scratch," Vexther confirmed. But that wasn't the end of it. As she was heading back to her lines, she stopped at 2 more wounded coalition soldiers and performed basic medical aid. Used her remaining supplies on enemy combatants while her own people were running low on medical equipment. The pattern repeated throughout the second day. Human medics, engineers, even combat soldiers would risk everything to assist wounded coalition forces. It defied every principle of warfare that Vexther had learned over decades of military service. The most personal example came during the second night. Coalition forces had attempted a coordinated assault on the human position. Using explosive charges placed at weak points in the wreckage, one of the charges detonated prematurely, triggered by unstable debris from the crash site. "I was caught in the secondary explosion," Vexther said, unconsciously touching his empty eye socket. Plasma fire, twisted metal, electrical discharge from damaged ship systems. The blast threw me 30 meters and buried me under a collapsed hull section. In the chaos that followed, coalition forces assumed their commander was dead. Human forces had no reason to risk their lives for an enemy officer, but someone had other ideas. I regained consciousness to find a human mechanic named Dong-Su Lee digging me out of the debris, Vexther continued. He was using improvised tools, working alone, completely exposed to potential sniper fire from both sides. When he saw I was alive, he could have done anything, taken my weapons, used me as a hostage, left me to die slowly. Instead, Dong-Su had carefully extracted the injured commander from the wreckage, checking for spinal injuries and internal bleeding with the thoroughness of a trained medic. He had used his own water ration to clean Vexther's wounds and torn strips from his uniform to create emergency bandages. "He helped me back to coalition lines," Vexther said quietly. "Be a human mechanic armed with nothing but repair tools, walking an enemy commander through an active battlefield to safety." When I asked him why, he just shrugged and said, "Because you needed help." The tribunal sat in stunned silence as Vexther described the pattern that had emerged over 3 days of impossible warfare. Humans sharing their dwindling food supplies with coalition prisoners, as human engineers helping to repair damaged coalition equipment, human soldiers creating safe corridors for medical evacuations of enemy wounded. I tried to understand their strategy, Vexther said, his voice growing frustrated with the memory. Was this psychological warfare? Were they trying to convert my troops? Create some kind of propaganda victory? But their actions were too genuine, too costly to their own survival. By the third day, human ammunition was nearly exhausted. Their numbers had dwindled from 37 to fewer than 20. They had given away most of their medical supplies treating coalition wounded. Their food reserves were being shared with enemy prisoners who should have been left to starve. Any rational military force would have collapsed, Vexther concluded, But somehow they kept fighting. It's not just for their own lives, but for everyone on that battlefield, including us. The weight of that realization hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Galactic Coalition understood about warfare, survival, and the nature of conflict itself. The final assault began at dawn on the third day. Vexthor's remaining forces had systematically pushed the humans deeper into the crashed research facility, section by section, level by level. What had started as a simple capture mission had become a grinding siege that defied all military logic. By morning, we had them completely surrounded in the facility's lower maintenance levels. Vexthor said, his voice growing quiet with the weight of memory. 12 humans left alive. Oh, no ammunition, no heavy weapons, no possible escape routes. Scarred Commander described the final approach through the facility's twisted corridors. Emergency lighting cast eerie red shadows through the damaged hull sections. The air recycling systems had failed, leaving the atmosphere thick and stale. Every surface bore the scars of 3 days of intense fighting. I led the final breach. Personally, Vexthor continued. 200 of my best warriors, full combat armor, energy weapons charged and ready. We expected either a desperate last stand or immediate surrender. What we found was neither, as coalition forces surrounded the humans' final position in what appeared to be the facility's central computer core. Something unprecedented happened. Instead of raising weapons or white flags, the 12 surviving humans were frantically working at damaged computer terminals, trying to maintain power to some kind of massive communication array. Jamin was standing in the center of the room. Not behind cover, not holding a weapon, Vexthor recalled. He had a datapad in his hands and the most desperate expression I'd ever seen on any being's face. But it wasn't desperation for his own life. General Crixtos shifted impatiently in his seat. Surely you demanded immediate surrender at that point. I did. Vexthor nodded, activated external speakers, and gave them 30 seconds to lay down arms and submit to coalition authority. Standard final ultimatum protocol. But instead of the expected response, Jamin had stepped forward with his hands raised, not in surrender, but to show he was unarmed. The young human leader walked directly toward Vexthor's position, ignoring the dozens of weapons trained on him. He moved like someone who had accepted death but needed to deliver one final message, Vexthor said, his remaining eye growing distant. No fear for himself, just an urgency that seemed to consume his entire being. When Jamin reached speaking distance, he had extended the datapad toward the massive coalition commander. His voice was hoarse from 3 days of combat, but his words were crystal clear. Commander, you need to evacuate your troops. All of them. Now the evacuation window closes in less than 6 hours. Vexthor had initially assumed it was some kind of desperate bluff or psychological trick. Human surrender negotiations often involved attempts to delay or confuse their captors. But something in Jamin's tone made him accept the datapad. The readings made no sense at first, Vexthor admitted. To the tribunal. Seismic data, geological surveys, core temperature measurements, volcanic activity projections. I'm a military commander, not a planetary scientist. Dr. Tisara's bioluminescent patterns shifted to alarmed orange tones. Wow. What did the data indicate? Planetary core destabilization, Vexthor said grimly. Triggered by the orbital bombardment that preceded our ground assault. The planet's volcanic systems were cascading toward a catastrophic eruption that would sterilize the entire surface. The implications hit the tribunal like a physical blow. Admiral Kethrel actually stood up from her chair, her aquatic features showing rare emotion. The orbital bombardment was standard pre-assault protocol. No one predicted geological consequences. The humans did, Vexthor said simply. Their geological survey team had been monitoring planetary instability for months. They knew exactly what would happen when we started dropping plasma charges on the surface. But the truly shocking revelation came when Jamin began explaining their actual mission. The crashed research vessel wasn't conducting military reconnaissance or weapons development. It was the final evacuation ship for civilian populations in the outer colony systems. The facility we'd been fighting over for 3 days wasn't A military installation, Vexter said, his voice filled with amazement even in recollection. It was an emergency evacuation center. The humans were coordinating the rescue of over 50,000 civilian refugees, both human and coalition. Species. Hai-Jin, the young medic who had saved so many coalition soldiers, stepped forward to show Vexter the communication array they'd been desperately trying to maintain. Massive holographic displays showed the positions of hundreds of evacuation ships scattered across the system. Every hour we kept you engaged here was another hour for the evacuation fleets to reach minimum safe distance. The volcanic eruption will create a debris field that extends 3 astronomical units from the planet. Any ship caught inside that radius will be destroyed. The tactical picture became horrifyingly clear. The humans hadn't been fighting to win a battle, they'd been sacrificing themselves to buy time for one of the largest humanitarian evacuations in galactic history. I asked the obvious question, Vexter said to the tribunal. Why didn't they tell us from the beginning? Why fight us instead of explaining the situation? The answer came from Hai-Jin, and it shattered every assumption Vexter had made about human nature. The young medic looked at him with tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking with exhaustion and grief. Would you have believed us, Commander? Would you have stopped shooting long enough to listen? Your orders were to capture us for interrogation. How long would it have taken to convince your command structure that we were telling the truth? How many evacuation ships would have been lost while we argued about our credibility? Vexter sat in stunned silence as the full magnitude of human sacrifice became clear. They had chosen to die fighting rather than risk the possibility that diplomatic negotiations might delay the evacuation by even a few hours. The evacuation coordinators were in constant communication with refugee ships, Jamin added, showing Vexter real-time tracking data. Coalition, civilian vessels, human transports, independent merchant ships, everyone mixed together in the largest rescue operation in this sector's history. Among the ship manifests, Vexter saw names that made his blood run cold. Coalition. Colony ships from his own home system. Refugee vessels, carrying families of soldiers under his command. Even ships from the hegemony's core worlds. We weren't just buying time for human evacuees, Hai-Jin said quietly. We were buying time for your people too. Your families, your civilians. Everyone who couldn't defend themselves when the planet turned into a ball of molten rock. The weight of that revelation crushed down on Vexter like the collapse of mountains. For 3 days, he had been trying to kill the very people who were dying to save his own species. The silence in the tribunal chamber was absolute, even the ambient hum of the space station's life support systems seemed to hold its breath as Vexter reached into his chest armor with deliberate movements. His massive claws carefully extracted a collection of military decorations that represented for decades of distinguished service. Each medal told a story of valor and victory. The Silver Nebula for courage under fire at the Battle of Proxima. 7. The Galactic Cross for tactical brilliance during the Asteroid Belt campaign. The Supreme Service Medal for leading the liberation of 3 occupied worlds. These weren't just pieces of metal. They were the physical embodiment of his identity as a warrior and leader. These decorations defined who I was, Vexter said, his voice carrying a weight that made the tribunal members lean forward unconsciously. Every citation, every commendation, every honor earned through blood and sacrifice. They represented everything I believed about strength, duty, and the nature of warfare itself. One by one, he placed each medal on the metal table with ceremonial precision. The soft metallic sounds echoed through the chamber like funeral bells. Dr. Tessara's bioluminescent patterns had shifted to deep purple, a color her species displayed only during profound emotional experiences. The evacuation was completed while we were still in the facility's lower levels. Vexter continued, his remaining eye fixed on the medals before him. 53,000 civilian refugees from 12 different species, including over 8,000 coalition citizens. All safely beyond the danger zone because 12 humans chose to die buying them time. Admiral Cathrell's usually efficient demeanor had completely dissolved. Her aquatic features showed raw emotion as she processed. The implications. Your fleet. How did they know to evacuate? Jammin transmitted the warning directly to my flagship, while we were still fighting in the corridors above. Vexter replied. Even as my warriors were advancing on their position, even as they were preparing for their final stand, he was using the facility's communication array to save my people. The scarred commander described the frantic final hours. While coalition forces had been systematically clearing the facility level by level, the humans had been working desperately to maintain power to their communication systems. Every minute of resistance had allowed them to coordinate more evacuation ships, verify more refugee manifests, guide more vessels to safety. My fleet commander, Admiral Dekvar, initially thought the human transmission was some kind of trap, Vexter said. But the geological data was too precise, too detailed to be fabricated. He ordered emergency evacuation protocols for all coalition vessels in the system. The evacuation had been a masterpiece of logistical coordination under impossible circumstances. Human and coalition ships working together, sharing navigation data, coordinating jump sequences, protecting slower vessels with faster escort ships. Ancient enemies cooperating in the face of planetary annihilation. The volcanic eruption came exactly 6 hours after Jamin's final transmission, Vexter said, his voice growing hollow. Not 5 hours, not 7, exactly 6. Just as their geological models predicted. The planet's surface was scoured clean by molten rock and superheated gases. Nothing could have survived. But both human and coalition forces had escaped to orbit in time. The evacuation shuttles that lifted off in the final hours carried wounded soldiers from both sides, medical personnel who had treated enemies as patients, and survivors who had witnessed 3 days of warfare unlike anything in recorded galactic history. I spent 3 days trying to kill humans who were dying to save my people, Vexter said, his voice breaking with emotion. The real shock isn't that they fought us, it's that they fought for us, even as we were killing them. Stood slowly, his 8-foot frame casting long shadows across the tribunal chamber. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of absolute conviction. Kim died holding blast doors shut with his bare hands, so the last evacuation. Shuttle could launch safely, he said. The doors had been damaged by explosions, the automatic systems had failed. He held them closed manually while superheated gases from the volcanic eruption began flooding the facility. The image haunted everyone in the room, a young human using his final moments, not to save himself, but to ensure others could escape. Hyjin Park died in the medical bay, treating wounded coalition soldiers even as the facility's structure began collapsing around her. Vexter continued. She could have evacuated with the medical shuttles, but she chose to stay behind with patients who couldn't be moved. Dong-Su Lee died at the communication console, maintaining contact with evacuation fleets and transmitting final navigational updates. The console was electrified from battle damage. But he kept working through the electrical burns because ships were still depending on his guidance. Each death represented a choice, the choice to sacrifice individual survival for the greater good. Regardless of species, nationality, or previous hostility, General Crixtos, who had remained skeptical throughout the testimony, finally spoke. Commander, these are extraordinary claims. If accurate, they challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and warfare itself. They should challenge our assumptions, Vexter replied firmly. Because I can no longer serve in a military that would call such beings enemies, hereby formally request immediate transfer to the new Human Coalition Medical Corps. The announcement hit the tribunal like a plasma blast. A decorated commander voluntarily abandoning his military career to join a joint service with former enemies was unprecedented in Coalition history. If humans can show mercy to those actively trying to kill them, if they can sacrifice their lives for the families of their enemies, well then, perhaps there's hope for something better than endless warfare between our species, Vexter said. Perhaps there's hope for actual peace. The tribunal chamber erupted in chaos. Adjudicators shouted questions, recording devices overloaded with data, and security personnel moved to restore order. But Vexter was already walking toward the exit, his decision made and his testimony complete. At the chamber doors, he paused and turned back one final time. His remaining eyes swept across the 5 tribunal members. the scattered metals on the table, and the recording equipment that would carry his words across the galaxy. The humans taught me something that for decades of military service never could, he said, his voice carrying clearly over the chaos. True strength isn't measured by what you can destroy, but by what you choose to save, even when it costs you everything. The doors closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving the tribunal to grapple with testimony that would reshape interstellar relations and redefine the very nature of courage, sacrifice, and hope in a galaxy that had known too much war. The end.